So I am Nick Clemens. I'm one of the developers at ByWater. I have been a Koha developer for several years. I have been a former release maintainer. I'm on the QA team, and I refer to myself as a sonic screwdriver, which means you can point me at a problem, and I'll make a lot of noise, and something will happen. I don't know what. So basically, I just want to talk a little bit about the performance of Koha and what we've been doing with that. I've been working on this for like the past year. We've had a lot of newer libraries, larger libraries, and libraries that have been on Koha for a long time. As that happens, we kind of see new issues where somebody with a lot of data or somebody with a lot of historical data can see things get a little bit slower. Sorry. So basically, there's really three steps that we kind of go through when we're talking about looking at Koha performance. First of all, you have to identify the issue. You know, what module is it in Koha? What role does it play, and kind of what's happening there? Two, pinpoint the bottleneck. What is going on in the code? What's happening there that's, you know, slowing it down? And what do we really need the code to output in the end? And three is proposing a remedy, where we have to balance the performance with coding guidelines and with the user needs. So TLDR, the three things that I'm really going to talk about are using Nightprof and Benchmark, which are Perl tools that help you evaluate how fast your code is running and see what's going on under the hood. The second is using Test Builder. Test Builder is a technical piece of software that we use within Koha in our tests to create objects, but we can use it here when we're testing performance to kind of fill in our test Koha so that we have things to test. And three, it's just that when we're developing Koha and we're working on Koha, we need to think big. We need to remember that there are libraries with lots of data, consortiums with lots of libraries, and just consortia with lots of needs. And so they kind of compound the big data, the big libraries. So the first step, of course, is identifying the issue. There's a couple things that can happen here. It can be something where we get a report from the library. This can either come from the staff or the patrons, or it's something that we just happen to see on Bugzilla. Now, I don't know if everyone out there is registered on Bugzilla. We're going to talk about that later. But it is important that when you have these performance issues, to file them on Bugzilla. That's the way that you can let all the developers out there know. And you can kind of too, if you promote that bug, find out the other users who experience this, so we can see if it's kind of a widespread issue or if it's something narrow to your library and something that you use. The second way that we find things is when developers find them through what I like to call spelunking, which is either when we're testing other bugs, we'll kind of just see something and we'll say, hey, we could make that better. Or when we're writing a new code, we need to kind of keep this in mind, and we can end up seeing other things as we add our new code to the system. So the first piece of software, which I think is really cool, I know this is a really exciting slide for all of you, is Nightprof. These are the simple instructions on how to set it up. Just pulling up my notes. When I talk about using Nightprof, I talk about excluding everything from Plaque. Plaque is a tool that Koha uses to speed things up. I like to test performance outside of Plaque because it tends to highlight the problem and make it a little bit easier to see. But what does Nightprof do? It makes flames. Yeah, flames are cool, everybody. What this graph actually does, this is showing you visually the loading of a page in Koha. And what you can kind of see is by how wide any one of these stacks are, it's showing you the percentage of time that is spent in that part of Koha. When you have this longer one, you can kind of see then all the little pieces and which parts of that take up the most time. This is a really useful tool for developers, and I highly encourage using it because it helps you know how much time you can actually save by your improvements. I personally know that I have occasionally spent a lot of time improving performance on something that's this section. Overall, you don't feel that. It's not bad. Let me be clear, we should still do it. But when you're looking to make dramatic changes, you need to make sure that you're picking something that has a much wider impact. This is just a second view of that in case you don't want to look at the flames, which of course you do. But if you need a more readable view, this is the same output, and it just shows you here the exclusive time and the inclusive time spent in every routine. Exclusive time is how much time was spent literally in that code. Inclusive time includes all of the subroutine calls that it makes. So this is kind of really the first step that we start when we're assessing a problem, is seeing where the biggest chunk of time we can regain is. And then what I like to do is compound the problem. Again, very exciting slides. This is just a little bit of code that I use, and I've shared this with Lucas and several other people, that will just put a bunch of holds in my test system. What I like about this code is that it's really easy to adjust. It's real easy using Test Builder to just tell it to make a hold and place a hold. And you can tell it to place a hold for 50 patrons, 100 patrons, 1,000 patrons. Because until you do this, sometimes things look really good. And making big data makes it a lot bigger to see what's going on. So when we're doing this, we need to consider real world sources. A lot of times developers aren't working on your production systems. In fact, we're not allowed to work on your production systems directly, which is good for you. So we need to consider the real world sources, consider the history. The longer a library is around, the more like statistical data they'll have in the system. And sometimes when we're developing a new feature, we don't see that, or we haven't planned ahead to have all of that kind of in there and loading all of that. I always want to remind to consider consortia. When we develop a feature for a specific library, we need to keep in mind how that's going to play out when you have a group of libraries using the software. And then consider special cases. And that was just like, special cases are when the software gets used in either new ways or just ways that we didn't expect. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of different ways of people implementing curbside pickups until we developed a curbside pickup plugin. Seed catalogs. Koha was never really intended for that. And when people started doing that, we had to find out new ways to do it. And when we do that, we see kind of where there are places to improve in Koha. And then you wait. When you're testing these things, when you're doing performance and you have finally been able to generate the problem again, you're gonna have to wait while you test. So sometimes it's good to get up, go get some coffee, come back. Once you've kind of seen that, you've evaluated where the problem is, you've got the data that can show it. This is really the meat of it, is what are we gonna do? How are we gonna evaluate the code? How are we gonna fix it? So there may be more than one way to crack an egg. A lot of times developers, we are sometimes referred to as lazy, which is definitely not fair. However, we will reuse code. If there is a routine out there that will give us the data that we need, sometimes we're just gonna go ahead and reuse that. Well, that can be problematic if we're using it in a different way that it was intended. Recently, there was a performance issue found with the budget dropdowns on one of the pages, where in order to load the budget dropdown, we were calling a routine that went and got all the budgets in the system and then calculated how much was spent on each budget, and then calculated how much was received on each budget, and built all these totals to, in the end, throw away half the data and just show you a list of budget names. So sometimes it's kind of that looking back on what have we done and seeing what we need to do next. Maybe don't. Sometimes we have code that is doing things that we just don't need to do. And I'm going to mention something that I'm going to bring up again later, but there's a feature in Koha that allows you to renew a patron's book if there are holds on the book, but those holds can be filled for other items. It takes a lot of things to calculate whether or not we can fill all the holds on an item. Sometimes, though, the patron has already reached the renewal limit. Well, in that case, do we need to go ahead and check if all the holds can be filled because they already can't renew it? So that's a quick way to kind of gain some performance there. Cache is king. Caching has become a big issue in Koha. We've been implementing this everywhere to kind of make a lot of the values come up a lot faster. If we can load things once, save them and reuse them, it really can enhance our performance time overall. Give me more. Consider prefetching. Really, I just wanted an excuse to put Brittany in my slides, everybody. I'll admit it. Okay, there she is. But it's true that a lot of times too, what we find is that there's code that where we've added new things to the display. As we've added them to the display, we've just kind of called them from the database again. Instead, if we call everything at once, we can make things run a lot faster. Sweat the small stuff. We're working on a problem with the holds page being slow, where we found that libraries who had a ton of holds on one book, it was very slow. And there were some other things to tackle, but one of the things that I found at one point was that the holds page, when we were loading it, was about 16 megs. That's really big for a web page. And it turned out that what that was every hold has a dropdown of priority, and all of those dropdowns had line breaks in between them. And it was making the files so long that it was actually taking time to download it. And all we had to do was kind of reduce the HTML and everything got a little bit faster. So make sure to consider those things. Now back to the boring code bits. Once you've gone through and you've kind of decided where you can make the cuts and what you can do, there is a Perl module called benchmark, with a routine called cmpthese or cmpthese. This is something that Martin Renvoys at PTFS Europe, actually, he wrote this little subroutine here that I use all the time. What this will do is it will spit out kind of different rates of how fast each bit of code runs. So it will tell you, if you put in there 4 different ways to do the same thing, it would at the end will give you a list of how fast each one of those were. Sometimes if you ask this thing the wrong question, you can get the wrong answer. There was at one point where I filed a bug in the Koha community. It's 30169. If you want to go see me be incredibly wrong, where I just looked at the performance wrong. I was trying to see if using a specific method in Koha was fast. And so I called it a bunch of times on the same biblio. Well, if you do that, yeah, it's slow. But it turns out that if you use it in a real world example where you call it once for a row of data that you're going to kind of iterate over, so you're looking at a bunch of biblios, then it's actually faster. So this is just a cool tool for developers out there. Once you've done this, wait again and again. You're going to need to repeat your tests. As you kind of look at the code, evaluate, perform it, then you're going to need to test it. It's a slow process. It takes a lot of time to put in to reduce the time that you're going to get out. And we keep doing it. Once you've done a little bit, you found one place that you can improve it, then I go back to the flame graph, check the flames again, see what I've shrunk, see where I can shrink it again, and repeat. Now, these are just some useful tips for developing in Koha. Break it down. This is just a funny webcomic that I love. The important thing is to make small steps. When we're submitting code to Koha, when we're making changes to Koha, if we commit in little bits and we make sure that it's understandable what we've done, and we make sure that everyone can read what we've done and can test what we've done, then it makes it easy to get what we've done into the community. It's very important to try not to redo the performance of the page by rewriting the entire thing in one go. If you do that, it's great, but it's going to be hard to move forward just because it can be hard to understand. Bring your receipts. When you're testing the performance, make sure that you show people the benchmarking you've done, the time that it is that you have saved, so that they can recreate it, so that they can test it, and they can know whether it's worth it or not. It's important to be able to show people not just what you've done to improve it, but how to recreate the slowness as well. Now, this is one of the important parts about working on performance, which where it really gets tricky, is that making things faster, we can do that, but sometimes we need to pay attention to the needs of the user. So before I mentioned where renewals, if a user is over their renewal limit, we don't need to check the holdability. However, it turns out that a lot of libraries want to know that the book is on hold. They want to know if they can not override the holds, but they can override the renewal limit. And so while we've made it faster, we haven't actually improved the performance for users because we have taken away data that they've relied upon. So it can be a tricky thing. Who is the boss here? It is the users. Developers, we can want to do whatever we can to make it faster, but if it doesn't help, there's not much point to it. Oh. The more that you work on performance in Koha, the more it starts to become part of your mindset. You remember that this is what you need to work on. And as we develop new things, we can keep it in mind that we need to think about these big data. I personally, a lot of developments that when I work on them, I will load about 30,000 books into my test environment, which is not a lot compared to many of the libraries out there, but it's way more than the 400 that our kind of test environment comes from. So it's important for the developers to remember that they need to look at real life systems, consider how this is going to affect it, and consider what else we might affect. Questions? Yeah.
It's not so much a question as a couple of comments. If you've ever read the works of Frank Gilbreth Jr. about motion study, you'll find that there is a direct correlation between laziness and efficiency. Also, I'm not sure if this would work in your case, but whenever I'm working on something like export of data or trying to put together exported data into a bibliography, I always do version A, version B, and save everything, because it comes sometimes having something from 3 or 4 generations back really, oh, that's where I went wrong. One project I was working on, I got down to version V, version W. But, fortunately, my coworker and I figured it out before I ran out of letters. But save everything.
I have questions for Nick. Okay, Nick, how best can users let you know that something specific is feeling slow to them? What things can they tell you that will help you find it quicker?
Okay. The URL is one of the most important bits of for us. Koha generally tends to be very, very static with their URLs. So if you have the actual URL that you went to, that is enormously helpful in letting us know where you're at in Koha. Screenshots, when you take a screenshot, if you just screenshot the whole thing, the browser bar, I mean, nothing that you don't want to share. If you have tabs open, move it to its own tab. But if you can capture the whole browser, just so we can kind of see everything about the URL, what's going on the web page, kind of details like that help us find where that problem is. The other thing that is very helpful is if you have noticed a performance decrease or something changed, consider, have you changed anything else? If you suddenly switched a system preference, if you had an upgrade, anything like that, letting us know helps us kind of pinpoint where that might be. Or if you've had a systems change, then we just glare at the systems team. We glare at each other. Yeah.
So Nick, I have a question for you. And I think this will probably circle around back to what you had talked about at the very beginning, but how can people, what is the best way for people to talk about these things with you? Is it are you waiting for just something to break, or is there a place that you would prefer people to insert themselves, get involved, and try and notice these things before they hit production?
So Bugzilla is a great place to be involved. If you can test on Bugzilla, if you are able to use the sandboxes and try out new features and try them with the knowledge of how your library is going to use them, that will help identify the problems before they get pushed. Beyond that, if you have a support company, put in a ticket. Like if you see things or you're concerned about something or how it's going, let us know. That's always great to know. If you don't have a support company, then just the Koha community in general is a good place to be involved. IRC, the developers were all usually present there, as well as the rest of the community is there. And on Bugzilla, we'll talk about more in the community involvement, but there is on Bugzilla, there's also a votes feature. And while that's not 100% reliable, voting for something doesn't guarantee you're going to get it. The developers, we do try to look at that and sort bugs by those votes to see what's important to people in the community. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think too, with getting involved in it, there's only so much you can do in the testing environment because you're not putting it against real world data or your real world workflows, because you're not necessarily the person that does the stuff on the circulation end or the cataloging end, and you might have a general sense of what to do just to get it to do its thing, but you don't know all the little things that your staff see every day in production.
And that actually goes back to Liz's question as well. When you're reporting these problems, report the whole workflow. Rather than just the part that's having the problem, because sometimes it may be that the developers intended a different workflow. We were just talking to Rhonda earlier about a potential development in the acquisitions, and as I started to suggest things, I was like, wait, you tell me the workflow you want, because the last thing you want is for the developers to decide the workflow, because we tend not to think in the same way that other people do. A lot of things that seem very clear and straightforward to us, they don't seem that way to the user.
Any other questions for Nick? She's interested in seeing the rest of the Pablo Picasso.
Oh. That's Scott Kupperman. He also draws a comic called Snake and Bake, or Snake and Bacon, not Snake and Bacon, which I highly recommend. But it's basically, it's just Picasso yelling angrily at things and saying he's going to break them down into little cubes. And then at the end, there's of course a duck singing to him, crooning to him while fairies rock him to sleep, singing, I'm going to knock him down into little cubes. And the slides are all available. There's a URL way at the beginning.
Yeah, we'll have these online
They'll be
sometime
online,
next
yeah.
week.
I've got what might be a leading question. So, how many of the people, maybe this is a question for the people in the room. How many of you are librarians that work in a library, like checking books in, checking books out, helping people at the reference desk, doing cataloging? How many of you do that kind of work? And so how many of you check Bugzilla regularly? I see maybe 3 hands. How many of you, communicate with developers from time to time regularly, either on Bugzilla or with your support company or through other ways? About the same number of hands. So would there maybe be a good time at this conference when somebody could talk about, ways for librarians to better connect with support companies and with Bugzilla? Like maybe a time on Thursday at 9 a.m. in the morning?
I think there would be.
Would maybe Jesse, Kelly, and Nick all be able to address that at that time?
We will. Previews of coming attractions.
I think that's one of the most, I talked about this when we did the fully online Koha conference back at the beginning of the pandemic. is I think one of the best things that I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks between librarians and Koha is that the people that actually do the work at libraries sometimes don't communicate well with the people that write the software, the people that develop the software. Sometimes there's a disconnect there. And I think just being able to learn how to better interact with Bugzilla and how to talk to the developers and how to communicate, you know, I think it's one of the best ways to get involved in the Koha community is to, and to make Koha better, is to try to open those lines of communication. And so a program on Thursday at 9 a.m. about how to get more involved in the community is something that everybody could really benefit from. So thanks, Nick.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.